The prairie wind carried the sound of her crying. It wasn't the wail of a child, not the scream of a wounded woman, just a quiet, breaking sob that somehow cut sharper than any bullet. The man standing in the doorway of his half-built ranch house gripped the frame as if bracing against a storm. Inside, a woman he had met less than a week ago sat on a rough pine chair, her face buried in her hands. The words he had spoken, hard, bitter words, still hung in the air between them. "I want a wife, not a slave," he had said, and she had crumbled. The silence that followed was heavier than gun smoke after a firefight. He'd seen men die with less weight in their eyes, and though his voice had been firm, his chest burned with something he didn't have a name for. Shame, pity, a flicker of hope maybe. The prairie night pressed close around them, coyotes crying far off, as if the whole land had stopped to listen. But let's go back to where it all started. Subscribe now so you don't miss the next Western tale. And if this story grips you, give it a like and share your thoughts in the comments. The year was 1872, and the railroads were carving deep scars across the wild country like a knife through rawhide. Kansas still smelled of blood and gunpowder from the border wars, and every small town was a place of suspicion. Neighbors eyeing neighbors, men watching strangers with their hands never too far from their gun belts. Out beyond the towns lay the lonely spreads, a few dozen acres, a single sod house or timber frame, and a man trying to wring life out of soil that didn't want to give much. Elias McGraw had been one of those men. 35, shoulders broad from years of working horse teams, his face browned and carved by the sun. He wasn't handsome in the way city women might like, but the land respected him, and that was enough. At least it had been, until the silence of his own home began to eat at him. Days stretched long, nights longer, and though the work gave his hands purpose, it left his heart hollow. That was why he'd written the letter. Clumsy words, stiff and formal, sent eastward with money folded inside, payment for something he didn't quite understand. The paper had carried his loneliness across miles of rail and road to a company that promised companionship, a mail-order bride. When she stepped down from the stagecoach in Dodge City, Elias had expected, he wasn't sure what, a woman with fire in her eyes maybe, or someone desperate enough not to care where she'd landed. Instead, he found Anna. She was younger than him by nearly a decade, with hair the color of wet chestnut bark and a face that carried the softness of someone unaccustomed to prairie winds. Her dress was plain but clean, her hands fine-boned with fingers that seemed more fitted to a piano than to kneading bread. There had been no ceremony, no ring slipped onto her finger, just a handshake in the presence of the preacher and the signing of a paper that said she belonged to his household now. On the ride back to his ranch, Anna had barely spoken, her eyes fixed on the endless stretch of grassland, as if searching for the edge of the world. Elias tried a few words, questions about her journey, where she'd come from. She answered softly with a thick accent. German, he guessed, and always let her gaze wander back to the horizon. The ranch house was little more than 4 walls and a roof. A lean-to barn, a corral with 2 horses, a stretch of land that still fought him for every crop. Elias felt the sting of shame when he showed her the place. "Ain't much yet," he'd muttered, scratching the back of his neck. "But it'll stand." Anna nodded politely, her face unreadable. He wondered what she thought of him. This broad-shouldered man with calloused hands and a voice that never seemed to come out right. He'd hoped she might smile, even a small one, but instead she walked inside and touched the rough pine table as though she'd just stepped into another kind of prison. The first days blurred together. She cooked without complaint, swept the floor, even patched a shirt of his with neat, tiny stitches. Elias thanked her, but she only lowered her eyes. At night, she lay stiff beside him in the narrow bed, her breath shallow, her hands clenched as if bracing for something she couldn't stop. He tried to keep his distance, but the closeness was unbearable in its silence. By the 4th evening, he felt a weight pressing harder on his chest than the day's labor had. He came in from the barn, boots heavy with dust, and found her at the table peeling potatoes, her knuckles white on the knife handle. Something inside him cracked. He slammed his hat down on the table, startling her so badly she dropped the knife. "I don't need another servant in this house," Elias said, his voice rough as gravel. "I want a wife, not a slave." Anna froze. For a long moment she didn't breathe. Then her lips trembled, her eyes welled, and she broke. Quiet sobs slipped through her fingers as she covered her face, shoulders shaking. Elias stood there, fists tight, the words echoing between them like gunshots in a canyon. The prairie outside was hushed, the evening sun bleeding red across the horizon. Inside, the world seemed to tilt. He didn't move toward her, not yet. He just stood, staring at this woman who was supposed to be his partner, his companion, and realized he'd drawn a line neither of them knew how to cross. That night, Elias lay awake while Anna's back stayed turned to him. He listened to the coyotes' call, to the whisper of wind through the gaps in the cabin walls. His chest ached with a loneliness sharper than before she had come. And though his words had been born of frustration, he could still see the way her hands had trembled, the way she had folded in on herself like something too fragile for this land. The West was no place for fragility, but it was no place for cruelty either. Somewhere between those truths, Elias wondered what kind of man he was becoming. And out on the prairie, beyond the thin walls of the house, trouble was already stirring, trouble that would not wait for them to learn how to live with each other. The first sign was smoke on the horizon. The smoke drifted low and heavy, a thin gray ribbon rising from the far hills where the land curved out of sight. Elias noticed it while hauling water from the well, the slant of dawn cutting across the plains in streaks of gold. He stood with the bucket in his hands, the rope creaking, and narrowed his eyes. Too early in the day for campfires, too far from the main trail for a settler's cabin. The prairie held a language of its own, and smoke often meant something coming. When he returned to the cabin, Anna was kneading dough on the table, her sleeves rolled up, flour dusting her cheek. She didn't look at him, though she had sensed his mood already. She seemed to feel it in the way her hands slowed, her shoulders stiffened. "Something burning out there," he said quietly. Her eyes flicked up for a heartbeat, then dropped again. He thought about saying more, but he let it die. Words had only ever seemed to bruise her. Instead, he set the bucket by the stove and stepped back out into the morning. His boots crunching on dry earth. By noon, he'd learned the truth. A rider came hard down the dirt road from town, dust boiling up behind him. It was Josiah Carver, a rancher whose spread lay a few miles west. Elias leaned on the corral fence as Carver pulled up, sweat streaking the horse's neck. "You seen the smoke?" Carver called, his face dark with sweat and worry. Elias nodded once. "Cheyenne raiding party, they say. Hit a homestead 2 nights past. Took stock, burned the place clean. Folks in town are riled, talking about forming up a watch." Elias's jaw tightened. "You sure it's Cheyenne?" "That's the word." Scout brought news at dawn. Sheriff stirring the men. Elias stayed quiet. He knew enough to mistrust news that came on a rider's breath, but he also knew fire didn't rise from the ground for no reason. Carver leaned low in his saddle. "Best keep your woman close. These plains ain't forgiving, and townsfolk won't take kindly to any stranger faces just now." His eyes flicked toward the cabin door where Anna had appeared, her hands still dusted with flour. She stood silently, watching. Carver tipped his hat but didn't smile. He turned his horse and rode on, leaving dust and unease in his wake. Elias looked at Anna. She hadn't moved. Her gaze followed the rider until he was a speck on the horizon, then shifted to Elias, her eyes questioning but silent. "Inside," he said gently. She went without a word. That evening, Elias rode into town. He didn't want to leave Anna alone, but he needed to hear the talk himself. Dodge was alive with tension. Men gathered in tight knots outside the saloon, voices low, rifles leaning against posts. The sheriff, a broad man with a limp from some war wound, was at the center of it all. "They'll come again," the sheriff was saying. "You all know it. Raiders don't take once and quit. We'll need a watch on the north road, another on the creek crossing. Anybody spots smoke, you ride hard and fast." The crowd murmured agreement. Some spat in the dust, others gripped their rifles a little tighter. Elias stood at the edge, arms crossed, listening. He caught words like vengeance and teach 'em floating on the night air. Subscribe to stay with us on this journey. If you're still riding along, hit like, and tell me in the comments what you'd do in Elias's boots. Then someone mentioned families. A homestead widow, left with 2 young ones after the raid. Elias's chest tightened. He'd heard of her. Martha Dunn, whose husband had built their cabin with his own hands only last spring. Somebody ought to help her, a voice muttered, though no one volunteered. Elias left before the meeting broke, mounting up and heading back along the road. The moon hung low, silvering the prairie grass. He thought of the widow alone in the blackened ruins of her home, her children clinging to her skirts. He thought of Anna, waiting in silence, her hands folded in her lap as if prayer might be the only defense left. When he reached his ranch, he found her standing outside, arms wrapped around herself, though the air was mild. She looked at him as he dismounted, her face pale in the moonlight. "You hear?" she said softly, her accent thick. "It wasn't a question. I heard," he answered. She hesitated, then spoke again, halting but clear. "The woman. With children, alone." Elias frowned. He hadn't told her that part. Perhaps she'd overheard at the well, or maybe she simply understood too well what it meant to be stranded without kin. He set a hand on the saddle horn, weighing the choice pressing on him. Folks in town would harden themselves against outsiders, against anyone who seemed to step out of line. Helping the widow would mean taking on her burden, and maybe taking on the suspicion of every man watching. But he could see it in Anna's eyes. She knew what it was to be bound to strangers, to feel the cold edge of loneliness. If he turned away, it would not only condemn the widow, it would deepen the wall between him and the woman he had sworn, however clumsily, to call wife. "I'll ride at first light," Elias said finally. Anna's eyes softened just a fraction, as though a stone had shifted inside her. She nodded, and for the first time since she'd come, he saw the faintest flicker of trust. The sun rose red and heavy the next morning. Elias saddled his horse, packed what supplies he could spare, flour, coffee, a little salt pork, and tied them behind the saddle. Anna came to the doorway, her hands folded, watching him. "You go alone?" she asked quietly. "Safer that way." He paused, then added, "Town's already nervous. Don't want them thinking I'm raising a cause." She nodded slowly, her eyes fixed on him as if she wanted to say more, but she didn't. Elias mounted up. He looked at her once more, standing there in the doorway of the cabin that still felt more like a half-built dream than a home. Something in her posture struck him, half fear, half courage. He tipped his hat, then turned his horse toward the horizon. The prairie swallowed him, the sound of hoofbeats carrying across the grass. Each step took him closer to a choice he couldn't take back, and far off, where the smoke had risen, the widow and her children waited for kindness, or for the silence of a world too hard to care. The blackened timbers of the Dunn homestead still smoked faintly when Elias rode over the rise. The air smelled of ash and scorched earth, and the silence was wrong, too still, too watchful. His horse shifted uneasily, ears flicking as though it felt eyes on them. Elias scanned the prairie, hand brushing the butt of his rifle before nudging the gelding forward. The cabin was nothing but a skeleton. Charred beams jutted skyward like ribs, the roof caved in. Around the ruin, scraps of cloth and broken dishes littered the ground. The corral gate hung open, its posts blackened, no stock left inside. A child's cry cut through the air. Thin, weak, but sharp as a knife, Elias swung down, his boots sinking into the soot-softened earth. "Martha?" His voice carried low, wary. From the shadow of a half-fallen wall, a figure rose. A woman, her dress torn, her hair hanging loose in tangled strands. She clutched a small boy to her hip, another child, a girl no older than 6, standing beside her with dirt streaked across her cheeks. Her eyes were hollow, ringed with smoke and grief. But when she saw Elias, she stiffened, her jaw hardening. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice cracked but edged with steel. Elias stopped a few paces short, lifting his empty hand to show he meant no harm. "Brought food. Some coffee. Figured you might need it," the boy whimpered, burying his face against his mother's shoulder. The girl stared wide-eyed, clutching the hem of Martha's skirt. "I don't take charity," Martha said flatly. Elias set the bundle down on a patch of clean earth, then stepped back. "Ain't charity. Just neighborly." She looked at him a long time, suspicion warring with exhaustion. Then slowly she sank to her knees, pulling the children close. Her fingers trembled as she untied the bundle. The smell of salt pork drifted into the air, and both children's eyes lit with desperate hunger. Elias turned away, giving them space, but he heard the sound of tearing paper, the soft crunch of bread breaking, the quiet sounds of mouths devouring faster than any words could match. When Martha finally spoke again, her voice had softened but only slightly. "They killed Thomas," she said, her eyes fixed on the horizon. "Came at night. He never stood a chance." Elias bowed his head. "I'm sorry. They'll be back," she whispered. "You know they will. Raiders don't leave nothing half done, he didn't answer, because he knew she was right. On the ride back, the prairie stretched wide and endless, but Elias felt the weight of eyes in every shadow, every patch of grass that swayed against the wind. He rode stiff, scanning until at last the thin outline of his cabin appeared against the sky. Anna was outside, hanging laundry. When she saw him, her hands froze on the line, her eyes searching his face. He dismounted, tying the horse, and she waited without a word. "She's alive," he said simply. "Children, too." Anna let out a breath she'd been holding. "You help them?" He nodded. "Left food. Wasn't near enough." Her eyes softened, but the line of her mouth stayed tight. "Town, they not like this." "No," Elias agreed. "They won't." He carried the bucket from the well, set it by the door, and sat heavy on the step. The weight of what he'd done pressed on him. Helping Martha was the right thing. He felt that in his bones. But it was the kind of right that turned neighbors into enemies. Anna came to stand near him, silent for a long while. Then softly she said, "You are a good man." Elias looked up sharply. It was the first kind thing she'd said to him since she arrived. Her face was calm, but her eyes carried something. Recognition, maybe, or the memory of her own hunger once eased by another's mercy. He wanted to answer, but the words lodged in his throat. Instead, he nodded, slow and rough. 2 days later, the sound of hoofbeats rolled across the plain. Elias was chopping wood when the echo reached him, a steady drum against the earth. He straightened, axe in hand, and watched the dust rise on the road from town. 5 riders, armed, moving with purpose. Anna stepped out of the cabin, her hands drying on her apron. Her eyes met his, wide, questioning. "Inside," Elias said. His voice was calm, but his stomach knotted. She hesitated, then obeyed, vanishing into the shadows of the cabin. Elias set the axe aside and walked out to the yard as the riders drew up. It was Carver at the front, his broad frame hunched in the saddle, rifle across his lap. The sheriff rode beside him, his limp less noticeable on horseback. The other 3 were men Elias knew by face, if not by name. Neighbors, everyone. Carver's eyes were sharp, his jaw set. "Heard you been out to the Dunn place." Elias kept his hands loose at his sides. "I went," Carver spat in the dirt, "and left supplies." "That true?" Elias didn't flinch. They were starving. The sheriff's gaze flicked between them, unreadable. The other men shifted, the leather of their saddles creaking. "You think you're doing good," Carver said, his voice low, dangerous. "But you bring heat on all of us. You feed them, you keep them alive, and next thing you know, they're back on your doorstep. Or ours. You want to invite that kind of danger?" "They're people," Elias said evenly. "A woman and 2 young ones. They didn't light that fire." Carver leaned forward in his saddle. "Maybe not. But they carry it. Don't matter if they asked for it. Trouble sticks to the weak like burrs. And you're dragging it right into our laps." The sheriff cleared his throat. "Enough, Josiah. Man's got a right to choose who he helps." Carver shot him a look but didn't push further. Instead, he turned his glare back on Elias. "You best think hard, McGraw. We're all walking a fine line. Don't make the rest of us pay for your bleeding heart." With that, he yanked his reins, spurred his horse, and the group wheeled as one, thundering back down the road in a cloud of dust. Elias stood in the yard long after they were gone, the echo of hoofbeats fading into silence. His jaw ached from clenching, his chest heavy with the weight of what was coming. Behind him, the cabin door creaked. Anna stepped out, her eyes on him. She didn't ask what they said. She didn't need to. The look on his face told her everything. The prairie was quiet, but in that quiet, Elias felt the storm gathering. Something was coming, closer than smoke, heavier than rumor, and when it came, it would come for him. The next evening, the wind shifted. It came out of the north, dry and sharp, carrying with it the smell of wood smoke. Not the distant haze of a burned-out cabin, but fresh fire. Elias smelled it before he saw anything, standing by the corral with a bridle in his hand. His horse tossed its head, snorting, uneasy. Anna came out of the cabin, her shawl drawn tight around her shoulders. She caught it too, her nose lifting, her eyes narrowing toward the horizon. Elias said nothing. He set the bridle aside and climbed the fence, scanning the line where prairie met sky. For a long moment there was nothing. Then he saw it, a smear of smoke, low and wide, rolling like a storm cloud that refused to lift. War parties didn't travel quietly. That much he knew. By dusk, the proof came. Elias was stacking the last of the firewood when the sound of drums reached him, faint at first, carried on the wind like a heartbeat, then clearer, slow, deliberate. Anna froze where she stood, her face turning pale. She whispered something in German, words he didn't know, but the tone was prayer. Elias set the wood down carefully, his hands steady, though his gut turned to stone. "Inside," he said. She didn't argue. He barred the door behind her, then pulled his rifle from its stand by the hearth. For a moment he just stood there listening. The prairie outside was alive now, the thump of hooves, the distant cries of riders calling to one another. They weren't close yet, but close enough to make his blood run cold. Anna sat at the table, hands folded so tightly her knuckles were white. The lamp flickered, casting her face in long shadows. She looked at him, waiting for words he didn't have. Finally, he said, "If they come, stay behind me." Her lips parted, but she didn't speak. Only nodded once, sharp, her eyes shining. Night fell heavy, the stars swallowed by smoke. Elias kept to the window, rifle in hand, watching the plains. The drumming grew louder, sometimes pausing, sometimes answering itself from farther off. It was no raid, not yet. It was a warning. Near midnight, hoofbeats rolled closer. Not a mob, not an army, just a handful of riders. Their silhouettes broke the ridge line, torches flaring in the dark. Elias's breath caught. He could see the glint of steel, the flicker of paint on faces and horses. Cheyenne. They stopped on the far side of the yard, torches held high. 5 men, their eyes fixed on the cabin. One lifted his hand, palm out, not hostile, not surrender, just a gesture of presence. Anna pressed a hand to her mouth. Elias steadied his rifle but didn't raise it. He felt the air vibrating with a choice. One shot, one twitch, and the night would ignite. The leader called out in a tongue Elias barely knew. The words carried across the yard, harsh yet calm. Elias didn't answer. Again the man called, slower this time, as if offering the chance to understand. Anna whispered, "What'd he say?" Elias shook his head. "Can't catch it." Silence stretched. The torches flickered, painting the men in firelight, their eyes bright and unreadable. Elias's palms itched against the wood of the rifle. Then, sudden and sharp, another sound cut through the night. A gun cocking behind him. Elias spun. Anna had not moved. The sound came from outside, off to the east. Another group, voices carried on the wind. English this time. "That's far enough, Carver." And with him 6 men from town. Their silhouettes rose from the grass, rifles aimed at the Cheyenne. The standoff locked tight. 2 groups of riders, both armed, both lit by fire, and between them Elias's small cabin, its windows glowing like the eye of a trapped animal. Elias stepped to the door, his voice low to Anna. "Stay down." Then he pushed outside. The night air hit him like ice, sharp and dry, filled with smoke and sweat and the smell of horses. "Hold," he shouted, his voice carrying harder than he expected. Both sides shifted, eyes cutting to him. The Cheyenne leader sat tall in his saddle, torchlight painting his chest with fire. Carver leaned forward in his own saddle, rifle steady. His men tensed like coiled wire. "Nobody fires," Elias said. Each word slow, deliberate. Carver barked a laugh. "You lost your senses, McGraw? They've come to finish what they started." The Cheyenne leader raised his hand again, palm outward. His eyes met Elias's, dark, steady, not wild with rage but cold with demand. Elias felt the weight of both sides pressing down. One wrong move, one word twisted, and the prairie would drink blood tonight. Anna's face flashed in his mind, her tears, her silence, the way she'd looked at him when he chose to help Martha. He thought of the children in the ashes of their home. He thought of the men behind Carver, too quick to fire, too eager to strike first. Elias lifted his empty hand, palm outward, mirroring the Cheyenne gesture. The torches crackled. The drums ceased. For a heartbeat, the world stopped. And in that stillness, Elias realized there would be no avoiding the choice. Peace or blood. Trust or fear. He could not stand between them forever. The impossible moment had come. The night held its breath. 2 fires burned on the prairie, one in the torches of the Cheyenne, the other in the fury blazing in Carver's eyes. Elias stood between them, his rifle heavy at his side, his palm lifted in a gesture that meant everything and nothing at all. "Step aside, McGraw," Carver snarled, his voice cutting through the silence. "You think they came here to talk? They came to mark us, to test how soft we are. You stand in their way, you make yourself one of them." Behind him, the other ranchers muttered in agreement, rifles twitching, nerves strung taut. The Cheyenne leader didn't move. He sat like stone in the saddle, eyes locked on Elias. Then he spoke again, a short burst of words, the cadence like water over rock. Elias didn't understand, but something in the man's tone, firm, measured, not rage but resolve, stirred him. Anna's voice came softly from the doorway behind him. "He say, they not come for fight." Elias turned his head, startled. She stood in the doorway, her shawl wrapped tight, her face pale but steady. "You understand him?" Elias asked. "Little," she whispered. "When I was girl in camp near Platte River, women trade words." Her eyes flicked to the leader. "He say woman and children taken. He ask if you give them food. If true." Elias's chest tightened. "Martha, the widow." He looked back at the leader, his heart pounding. Slowly he nodded once. "Yes," he said, keeping his voice even. "I gave them food." Anna translated in halting words, her accent thick, her voice trembling but clear. The leader's expression didn't change, but he dipped his chin, a gesture of acknowledgement. Carver barked a curse. "You fed their spies, you damn fool. You handed them reason to come sniffing at our doors." He raised his rifle, fury boiling over. Elias's voice thundered before the shot could break the night. "Lower it, Carver!" The command startled even himself. His voice carried like a rifle crack, steady and unyielding. They came asking, not raiding. "You fire now, you bring war down on every man, woman, and child from here to the Cimarron." For a long, dangerous moment, Carver's finger hovered on the trigger. His jaw worked, teeth grinding. Then, with a hiss of breath, he spat in the dirt and yanked his rifle back to his saddle. "You'll regret this, McGraw." The men behind him shifted uneasily, but none fired. One by one, they reined their horses, the tension bleeding slow and bitter into the night air. Carver turned his mount hard, riding off in a spray of dust, his men following. Silence returned, broken only by the crackle of torches and the restless stamping of horses. Elias exhaled, the weight of his choice settling heavy. He turned back to the Cheyenne leader. For a long moment they studied one another, the prairie between them thick with unspoken words. At last the leader spoke again. Anna translated softly. He say, "The woman. She is not enemy. She is mother. He thank you for not letting her die. He say, you see people, not just blood." Elias swallowed hard. He met the man's eyes, and for the first time, he felt not the weight of threat, but the recognition of another man carrying burdens of his own. Slowly, Elias lowered his rifle. The leader raised his hand one last time, palm open. Then he wheeled his horse, his riders following. In moments they melted into the night, torches winking out one by one until only the prairie remained, wide and dark and endless. Elias stood in the yard until the last hoofbeat faded. Then he turned toward the cabin. Anna was still in the doorway, her shawl drawn tight, her eyes shimmering in the lamplight. Inside, the silence pressed close. The fire in the hearth crackled, but neither spoke for a long time. At last Anna broke it. "Why you do this?" she asked quietly. Elias set his rifle down, rubbing a hand across his face. "Because if we answer every cry with a bullet, we'll have nothing left but graves. Martha, those children, they didn't ask for this war. Neither did I, neither did you." Her eyes softened, but her lips trembled. She stepped closer, her voice catching. "In my country, men not speak so. They take, they command. You see?" Elias looked at her then, really looked. At the woman who had been thrust into his life by contract and coin, who had cooked and stitched and wept under the weight of silence. And for the first time since she'd stepped off the stagecoach, he saw not a stranger, not a burden, but a partner waiting to be asked. "I told you once I wanted a wife. Not a slave," Elias said, his voice rough but steady. "Truth is, I don't know how to be a husband yet. But I mean to learn, if you'll let me." Anna's breath hitched, her eyes glistening. Slowly she reached for his hand. Her fingers were small, calloused now from the work of the prairie, but warm. For the first time she didn't tremble when his hand closed around hers. Outside, the night was quiet. No drums, no hoofbeats, just the steady whisper of wind through the grass, carrying with it the fragile, stubborn hope that peace, however brief, might yet hold. And when dawn came, it painted the prairie in gold. Not red, the prairie had a way of remembering. Long after hoofbeats faded and torches dimmed, the land kept the echoes, carrying them in the hush of wind through tall grass and in the scars of blackened soil where cabins once stood. Elias knew it as he rode the boundary of his spread in the days that followed. That memory was heavy, but it didn't always have to mean war. Sometimes it meant survival. Sometimes, if a man was lucky, it meant change. The town didn't forgive so easily. When Elias came in for supplies, men turned their shoulders. Conversations faltered mid-word. Carver's glare cut through every doorway. The sheriff, though, only gave a slow nod, the kind a man offers when he knows a burden too big for words. Elias accepted it. He hadn't done what he'd done to earn thanks, but at home, the air was different. Anna hummed softly as she worked, a tune foreign to him, lilting and gentle, carried in a language he didn't understand but felt in his bones. She began to meet his eyes when he spoke. Sometimes she even smiled, a small thing, fleeting but real. In the evenings, they sat together on the porch, the horizon stretching wide and endless, and the silence between them was no longer a wall but a comfort. One night, as they watched the sun sink red behind the hills, Elias spoke low. "You ever think of going back?" Anna's hands folded in her lap. For a long time she was quiet. Then she shook her head. "No back," she said. "Only forward." She turned to him, her eyes steady. "With you. Maybe not easy, but not alone." The words settled deep in him. He reached over, covering her hand with his. This time she didn't flinch. Weeks later, riders came again. Not Carver, not men from town. Cheyenne. Elias saw them crest the ridge at mid-morning, their horses moving slow, unhurried. He felt Anna stiffen beside him in the field, her basket of wash clutched tight, but he lifted a hand to her. "It's all right." The leader from that night rode at the front. His face was painted different, streaks of white and red across his cheekbones, but Elias knew him by the stillness in his eyes. Behind him rode two others, and then, to Elias's surprise, Martha Dunn. Her children clung to the horse she rode double upon, their small faces peeking out, weary but alive. Elias walked out to meet them, his hat low, his rifle nowhere in sight. The leader dismounted first. He placed a hand on Martha's shoulder, then stepped back. She slid from the horse, her children tumbling after her, and stood facing Elias. "They found me," she said, her voice hoarse. "Took me in, fed us. Said you had given food before?" She glanced at the Cheyenne leader, then back at Elias. Said a man who shared bread and hunger was a man worth trusting. Elias's throat tightened. He looked to the leader, searching his face. The man inclined his head once, slow and deliberate. Then he swung back into his saddle. No words were spoken. None needed. The Cheyenne turned and rode back the way they'd come, vanishing into the sweep of grass and sky. Martha gathered her children, her hands trembling as she tried to steady them. Elias led them toward the cabin, calling softly for Anna. She appeared in the doorway, her eyes wide but not fearful. When she saw the children, her expression softened. Without a word, she ushered them inside, already reaching for the bread on the shelf. That night, after the children slept on pallets by the hearth and Martha dozed with exhaustion in the chair, Elias stepped outside. The stars burned bright above, sharp as diamonds. Anna followed him onto the porch, wrapping her shawl tight. "They trust you," she said softly. Elias shook his head. "They trust kindness. I just happened to be the one standing there." She studied him, her eyes searching. Then she said, "Not many men stand." Her words cut deep, not as accusation, but as truth. He turned to her, his face lined with weariness, with years of solitude and soil and silence. "You think I can be the man you need me to be?" Anna looked out over the prairie, the wind tugging loose strands of her hair. Then she nodded once. "I think you already are." For a moment, neither spoke. The night was vast, holding them small and human against its endless stretch. Then slowly she reached for his hand. He took it, their fingers entwining in a quiet promise that felt stronger than any vow spoken before a preacher. Years later, folks would tell the story different ways. Some said Elias McGraw went soft, that he'd been fooled by painted riders and widows' tears. Others whispered that his ranch never burned because he'd earned the respect of men the town feared to name. Martha raised her children with Anna's help, and no hunger hollowed them again. But the truth lay not in the gossip of Dodge or the mutters of Carver's men. It lay in the simple way Elias and Anna lived, side by side, partners in the work and the silence, the laughter and the grief. On the table inside the cabin, among the tools and the lamp, sat a single photograph taken years later. Elias, broad-shouldered and solemn, Anna at his side, her hand resting lightly on his arm, Martha's children in front, grinning, their faces lit with the light of a life that had endured. The prairie remembered many things: blood, smoke, loss. But sometimes it remembered kindness too, and in that, there was hope. First, subscribe, because more powerful Old West stories are coming. Then, like this video and let us know your favorite moment in the comments.